All right, First Kings 19 is where we'll be today. We'll look at the whole chapter. I am very thankful for Craig to take First Kings 18 when I was gone, and I was thankful and I was a little jealous because I love preaching, teaching through where God is clearly magnified and false gods are clearly exposed, is First Kings 18. But Elijah is a fascinating character that shows up in the New Testament as well, and possibly at the end of time, he's maybe one of the two witnesses. We don't have their identity, but he is possible, a very good possibility that he's one of those two witnesses at the end of time that God has preserved for the tribulation time. The heights of spiritual victory is clearly we would expect Elijah to be so excited. If you were to interview Elijah after First Kings 18, it would be a mountaintop experience physically and spiritually at the same time. Like if there was an ideal situation that Elijah would find himself in, it would be the end of chapter 18. Everything is going well. The Israelites are the ones who are turning back to God, which as a prophet, as a spiritual leader, it would just be so exciting to hear the whole crowd saying, no, we've been following Baal. Uh, Yahweh is God. And so exciting. And then when Elijah says, don't let those false prophets escape, he doesn't go individually go grab all of the false prophets, drag them down and execute them. However, I looked up that the verbs tell us if it's plural or singular. And the end of the story of Mount Carmel, Elijah is the one who slaughters the 850 prophets. Oh. So likely he has help. He has them holding them down, but he is the one who performs the executions. Oh. Now, if God wanted us to do that, not being a warrior like David or Joab or other people who are known, Gideon even, who are known for fighting in many battles, hardened, it would be hard for me to put somebody to death. Hmm. But to put 850 men to death in one day would have an emotional toll on you and on me. So you have that aspect of what's carried over to chapter 19, as well as Elijah is physically likely exhausted. He has spent 3 years in hiding and concerned about being found. God has protected him, provided for him, yes, used him, but he has spent a lot of energy that day building that altar, constructing the altar, praying, executing the false prophets, praying again for rain for 7 different times, and then running 18 miles, all in the day to get back to Jezreel. And then he finds the next morning the prophets are dead, the false prophets are dead. Ahab is got his tail between his legs as the king. But who is most angry? Jezebel. She is livid whenever she has a banquet hall that seats 850. And that banquet hall was filled the days before those prophets were executed because they ate at her table and she provided for them. Now she's got all this food and no one to feed. And it is eerily quiet in the banquet hall because those prophets are not there. And they're not there because of one man. He put them to death with Israel's help. She is, if the story could have gone better for Elijah, there needed to be one more execution. Jezebel, right? Like if her life, if he could have in righteous wrath, and God says, okay, I'm gonna let you execute Jezebel too, that would have alleviated his problem because she really is the one who is most anti-God and God's prophets. She's the one who executed the godly prophets, and Obadiah and Ahab have to hide them. Ahab doesn't. When he finds out about it, he doesn't go do his wife's bidding then. And she's the one in the future who's going to conspire against Naboth to take his vineyard. So, although Elijah's life would have been easier without Jezebel in it, it's not her time. And God's not gonna use Elijah to take Jezebel out. He's gonna use one of the people at the end of the story of 1 Kings 19. So he's flying high, but he crashes hard in 1 Kings 19. And so often in ministry, whenever you have a really, really good days, for pastors, it's Sundays. Sundays are really exciting days. But you know what comes after Sundays? Mondays. And then you can have baptisms, you can have the Lord's table, you can have really good teaching, preaching, fellowship, interactions, and you can, as a pastor, as a minister, as a teacher, you've probably seen this too if you've ministered well and kind of exhausted physically after all of that. It's on Mondays that often you get attacked spiritually. And um, what do you do when despair comes on strong? What we see here in First Kings 19 is despair and its solution. There's a couple solutions, but the primary one is in the middle of this. And so let me get there in my Bible, First Kings 19. And there's only 21 verses, so we can cover those together. Ahab, in verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and she may have been demonically possessed, or she was so anti God. She is one of the most wicked people, consistently wicked people in all the Bible. And how Elijah had killed all the prophets with the sword, 850. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose, ran for his life, came to Beersheba, maybe 100 miles south, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. All right, we'll stop there. Have you ever wanted God to take your life? You say, that sounds a little bit suicidal. Now, Elijah's not suicidal, as Moses wasn't suicidal either in Numbers 11 when he despaired of his life and said, God, I just wish you would end it. Perhaps right after some great time of ministry like Elijah had, or maybe some life transition, or other mountaintop ministry experience. After that, there's a valley. And in the valley, sometimes the valley is so dark where we feel weak, physically weak, emotionally weak. We feel alone. Elijah definitely feels alone here. You feel helpless, and that consistent feeling over a couple days at least is going to help you feel hopeless. And that hopeless feeling defined is despair. Despair is this feeling of hopelessness, helplessness, maybe even in Elijah's time, meaningless. Like, okay, I've done my job. And I feel like, okay, I've done what you want me to do. Great victory. Now there's nothing more to live for. And this can lead to despair, hopelessness. What we can learn from 1 Kings 19 is from one of the greatest, godliest men ever to live. And what can we learn? If he is going to experience despair, we're not better than him. John the Baptist was there in prison. Moses was there when in Numbers 11. And so if these great men of God, some of the greatest men, felt despairing of life, you probably will too. And if you haven't, you probably will in the future. So what do we do when we have these dominating feelings of even despairing of life? Well, what caused Elijah to flee? You up to this point, you're like, this guy is afraid of nothing. He is like a man's man, tough guy, just executed all these prophets, prayed, God used him. He turned Israel back to God. And this weak, wicked lady threatens his life, and he's afraid of her. I've heard it said if she really wanted to kill Elijah, why didn't she send soldiers instead of a messenger if she knew where he was? It's likely that she maybe just wanted to intimidate him. That's why she sent a messenger. Her tail is probably between her legs too, because she has been knocked down tremendously. Baal worship was likely her idea, and she is exposed as a fraud, even though she's still the queen. She's the one who's feeding these prophets. She's the one who's promoting Baal worship, and now she is not popular at all as the queen. She is looking like a criminal, okay? And yet, so she's reacting and trying to get a reaction from Elijah, and he does kind of what she wants. She wants rid of him. She intimidates him, and he's afraid of her, and he arises and runs for his life. He's in Judah, which is a godly kingdom at this time. The kings who are in charge of Judah during Ahab's reign are Asa, who's a godly king who's seeking God, and then Jehoshaphat, who's also seeking God. So we don't know exactly when this happened, but both of those kings are godly. So he's in a godly territory, and yet he isolates himself. This is kind of what we do too. Whenever we have these feelings, we pull away from God's people instead of going toward God's people, and I intentionally isolate ourselves, which isn't helpful. But this is what fear of man can cause us to flee toward isolation. And then this isolation over time, verse 4, he himself went a day's journey. So he leaves his servant. So he has a servant. It's not Elisha at this time. We don't know who the servant is. But he leaves his servant, his only companion, and he goes a day's journey into the wilderness, says, okay, you stay in Beersheba, which was a city, and I'm going out of the city into a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came and sat under a broom tree. Now you can look up a broom tree. It looks like a kind of an upside down broom. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord. I'm going to substitute Lord for Yahweh because later on, you'll see it over and over, God's covenant name here, Yahweh. Take away my life, for I'm no better than my fathers. Now, if we were to analyze how God has used Elijah up to this point in 17 and 18, we'd say there is no one like Elijah who performed a resurrection. Only one person ever in human history did it up to this point, and it was him. And no one like Elijah was used to turn a nation back to God in just a matter of hours. And then he prayed. I recorded myself talking Elijah's prayer. 20 seconds long was Elijah's prayer. I don't know how long, 8 hours or so of foolishness from the Baal prophets. And Baal didn't answer them. And God answers after in a split second. No one has seen this before. And a man of faith, a man of prayer, all that God has done with Elijah in those 3 years, remarkable, remarkable. And yet he says, I'm not better than my fathers. Like, Elijah, what are you talking about? You're one of the greatest guys to ever live. But isolation causes him to want to die. Moses in Numbers 11, 14, and 15 has almost the same exact request. and it's likely in the same area of the world where Moses and Elijah talked to God 600 years apart. The burden of leading alone is too heavy, and he's going to tell God, I'm not better than my fathers. I'm isolated here. And what does he do in verse 5? He lays down and he sleeps under the broom tree. He is physically exhausted, understandably so. He is emotionally drained. He is just spent in every way. And he lays down. What he needs is he needs physical rest. So he gets some physical rest. And behold, an angel touches him. Where'd the angel come from? I mean, it comes out of nowhere. It doesn't explain this other than God sent this angel, godly angel, and says, hey, arise and eat. Very brief. Elijah's known for his brief statements to Ahab and Ahab's brief statements to Elijah. Here is a very brief statement. Arise and eat. God provides what Elijah most needs. He needs food. And then he gets more sleep. Food and rest, food and rest. And when we're exhausted, what do we need? We need food. We need rest. Okay. God is gracious, sustains his overwhelmed servant. So when we are dominated by feelings and despairing of life, sometimes what we need is rest and we need sleep and we need food. God provides these. And he lays down and sleeps. The angel wakes him up, arise and eat. And he looked, hey, behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He doesn't say, where does these come from? The angel brought them miraculously. Now, Elijah's known for being fed miraculously back in chapter 17, a couple years earlier, when the ravens brought him food. All right. And so he's used to this. He ate and drank and he laid down again. Thank you for the food, God. I'm still tired. And he falls back asleep. Verse 7. And the angel of the Lord, angel of Yahweh, came a second time. Now we know that the angel is from Yahweh. Comes a second time and touches him and says, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. Now, it sounds like later that this isn't God's plan for Elijah to go, but he likely knows that Elijah is looking to go further south. He's not looking to go north, which is where God wants him to minister in Israel. He's in the southern part of Judah, and his direction. He's going even further south. Okay. And so the angel knows that he's planning this journey. And so he's in the middle of the wilderness. He's going away from civilization. And today there's hardly any civilization from this town of Beersheba down to where he goes. Jabal al-Allah is likely Mount Sinai in Arabia. And it is barren. It's still desert to this day. There's not town after town where he's going to stop and get food. He's going to have to either take his food or like this, God's going to supernaturally make this food miraculous in his stomach. So he's not going to eat for 40 days. You're like, you can imagine this. Okay, and I don't know if he takes water or not, but he eats and he drinks. But the angel says, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights. That was his last meal for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, a couple times, Jesus and Moses, 40 days and 40 nights without food or drink, and that was miraculous. Okay, God provides for his food. And in the strength of that food, he knows that Elijah's going toward Horeb, the mountain of God, also called Sinai. You can look it up, Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. There's drone footage on this one website that I found yesterday that has a drone picture of a flyby of where this cave is on the side of Mount Sinai. It's remarkable. It's probably the size of this room or bigger, where Elijah comes, finds a cave, and he lodges in it. Okay, why does he go toward Mount Sinai? He knows Israel's history. He knows this is where God led the Israelites and they worshiped and they got the law and this is the covenant name for God was given at Mount Sinai. There's a lot of connections in the Old Testament to this holy mountain. And he comes to this cave and he lodges in it. And the word of the Lord comes, the word of Yahweh comes to him and says, hey, what are you doing here, Elijah? Looking for a reason. It's not like God's like, Elijah, I've been looking everywhere for you. What are you doing? Like, God doesn't lose Elijah. God finds him, okay? And he finds God. This is what Elijah most needs, and this is what you and I most need when we despair of life and we're dominated by feelings instead of God's truth. We need fresh glimpses of God. So God comes to his despairing servant and gives him a simple question. What are you doing here? And Elijah's going to give the same answer twice. In the first time, he says, I have been very zealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts. And he's talking to Yahweh. He doesn't say you. I said, I don't know why, but then he changes it to you, maybe catches himself and says, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. So now he realizes he's talking to Yahweh, the God of hosts. Mm-hmm. And he says, the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars and they've killed your prophets with the sword. What's fascinating is where he's talking to God is the place where the covenant was given. So he goes back to where the covenant was given, and he said, I wanted to get to this place because this place is where the covenant was initiated 600 years earlier with Moses. And this is where that covenant was initiated, and I'm here because they have broken the covenant that you gave at this place. So it makes sense why he was there. So he is you can hear the zealousness in his voice. You can hear the passion that this man has for God. And Elijah is known now for killing the false prophets, but Jezebel in particular is the one credited for killing godly prophets with the sword. In chapter 18, we saw that, and Obadiah had to save some of them. And he says, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So he has a zeal, people's disobedience, and because of disobedience, he says, I'm the only one left. And I'm just trying to save my life. Actually, previously, it would just be better if I was dead. He says that just one time, but here I'm very jealous for you, Yahweh. You're the covenant keeping God, and they have broken your covenant, and I am a messenger to them, and they are trying to kill the messenger now. So what's God's solution? Verse 11. He's very gentle and gracious with Elijah in this passage of scripture. He says, go out, stand on the mount before Yahweh. Okay, like Moses got to see Yahweh and the I am presented himself in a burning bush there. And then Moses got to spend 40 days and 40 nights with the whole top of this mountain. And it's still black to this day. You can watch a video and see how the mountain is charred from the presence of God when Moses was there getting the covenant originally. And Elijah's in this same location. And Yahweh says to him, stand before me. Come out and stand. Come out of your hiding, out of the cave. Stand before me. And behold, Yahweh passed by. This just sounds so much like Moses when Yahweh passed by him and proclaimed his glory, but we don't have the proclamation. What we have is a display of power. Now, Elijah knows the power of God. He knows that God can raise the dead because he saw God raise the dead. He knows that God can answer with fire because he just saw that. He knows that God can hold back rain and then provide rain when the skies were blue. He saw all of this, and yet he's doubting God. He just needs a reassurance that who he is, who God is. And so Yahweh passes by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountain and broke in pieces. And if you watch where Elijah's in a cave, it's all rocks around him. There's no trees, there's no bushes. All you can see is just huge, massive rocks all over the place. And this wind is so strong, and it sounds like Elijah's not pushed over or blown around, but the rocks are breaking in pieces before Yahweh, but Yahweh was not in the wind. This was just a display of Yahweh's power. And after the wind, an earthquake, and the whole mountain is shaking. And there was an earthquake back in Moses' day too on this mountain, but the Lord, Yahweh, was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. And we know that Yahweh appeared to Moses in a fire, and the people of Israel saw God as a fire on top of this mountain. but Yahweh was not in the fire. These were all displays of God's power. And God has shown Elijah his fire in consuming his altar. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper, a still small voice, another translation might say, or just a sound. And when Elijah heard this sound, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. He maybe had to hide himself, or he didn't come out until he heard God's voice. Like, that's God. And this voice comes, and it's still Yahweh talking to Elijah. And he says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he says exactly what he says in verse 10. So after God shows his display of power, maybe God's expecting a different response from Elijah. Obviously, God knows what Elijah's going to say, but he gives the same exact response. "What are you doing here?" And the same exact response. Okay. So God says, "Okay, I've showed you my glory. You're telling me the same thing." And you can compare 10 and 14. "I've been very jealous for the Lord, Yahweh, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword." Elijah has memorized this, and he says it word for word. "And I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Exactly what he said earlier. He's had time, he's had days of walking there to think about what he was going to say when God talked to him. And so that's the end of his despairing servant is unchanged in his response to Yahweh. So, what is God's solution? Whatever God says next, often we have to take as this is how God's going to bring us out of despair. And I can tell you by experience, this is how God has brought me out of despair on Monday. Whenever I've had some really, really exciting things happen on Sunday, like I'm just exhausted physically, I just need food, I just need sleep, and I just want to be done. Can I just do another job that's not so that is not so taxing emotionally? It's just overwhelming at times. This is often how God responds to me. And it's not in the fire and the wind and an earthquake. My house doesn't shake. This building doesn't shake. The pictures aren't crooked here. No, no, he just speaks with his word, and often with what he tells Elijah to do. And Yahweh said to him in verse 15, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." So Damascus is north of Israel. So he is in northern Saudi Arabia. He's got to go through. I looked at where Beersheba is, and that's in the far south of Judah. It's 243 miles today on a road to get to Mount Sinai. So he walked 243 miles south from the southern part of Judah, and he's got to go past that, probably get his servant and keep going north, go all the way through Judah, all the way through Israel, and north of Israel is where Damascus is. Okay. He actually, according to the rest of history, he doesn't actually go to Damascus. Not that's recorded. He's not the one who anoints Hazael, king of Syria. He's also not the one who anoints um, Jehu. It is Elisha, or Elisha's another prophet that does another prophet, an unnamed prophet, I think, anoints Jehu. Those are in 2 Kings 8 and 9. So years in the future. He does, though, however, does the third thing. So why does God talk about Hazael to be king of Syria? He's not the king yet. He's a servant or a commander in Ben-Hadad's army. And then Jehu, who's also a commander in Ahab's army. Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Mahola, shall you anoint to be prophet in your place. Anoint your successor. So how does this sound if you were to go to someone and you were in despair and they would say, "You just need to get back to work"? What? Get back to work? I'm tired of work. Okay, you've had rest, you've had food, and you had the most important thing that you and I will need spiritually. You had a fresh glimpse of God. Now it's time to get back to work. So what do we need in times of despair? Sometimes we need rest. Sometimes we need food. And most of all, we need a fresh glimpse of God from his word. Don't expect God to speak to you in an audibly small voice or anything like this. This is Old Testament. And God was still giving Elijah and other prophets revelation. No, expect God to speak to you how? Through his word. So you open his word and you don't close it until God speaks to you. And this is how God speaks to us and refreshes our soul when we're in despair, after we have done great things for God or God has used us and we're just tired. Rest, food, and then the most important thing, a fresh glimpse of God. See God's power. You'll see his power. He is still the God who can shake mountains. He is still the God who can send fire down. He is still the God who can turn the hearts of people back to him, as we saw just in this story. Okay, God can do all these things and so much more. And we can see his glory in the Old Testament. You can see his glory in the New Testament. You can see it in Genesis. You can see it in Revelation and everywhere in between. You can see God's power and glory. And when you're despair of life and you're like, okay, God, just take me. You're not suicidal, but you're like, okay, God, I know you're the author of life. I know you can stop my heart from beating. Just stop it now. Take me to heaven. Get me out of here. And God doesn't answer with, it's not your time.
Yeah.
You may want to go to heaven. And we don't know how old Elijah is ever. We never get a time. He isn't ministering a long time, maybe 20 years at most. Elisha, on the other hand, he's ministering like 60 years. Okay. Elisha's ministering a very short amount of time compared, and yet God decides when it's Elisha's time or Elijah's time, and he doesn't die. Okay. This guy pleases God like Enoch pleases God and walked with God so close. But in times of despair, he needed rest, he needed food, he needed a fresh glimpse of God. And God gave all those things to him. And then he says, get back to work. Here are the three things I want you to do. In fact, two of them you're not going to do. You're going to sub those out. You're going to tell Elisha to do one of them. Elisha's going to have somebody else do the Jehu anointing, but you're the one, Elijah, who's going to go get your successor. And this has to be a young guy because he served 60 years. He might be a teenager still whenever Elijah comes and gets him. Okay, so think of someone like Daniel as he goes into captivity. He's a young man. Elisha is a very young man when he starts because he serves at least around 60 years. And why does God want him to anoint these three people? Verse 17 tells us why. The one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. You're like, putting people to death? It might be that the reason Elijah's struggling is because he had to put those people to death. Okay. And I bring that up because he did have to execute them, and it was hard for him, and that was emotionally draining. But he's saying, okay, Elijah, you don't have to go stamp out all of Baal worship. Jehu's actually going to do a lot of that. We know that for sure. And then Elisha's going to do some of that. Okay, so this job is too big for you, Elijah. I get that. And you feel overwhelmed. I get that too. It's not all on you. You got help. He's got his servant to collect when he goes back north, but he's also on his way, is going to get Elisha. And then he says, verse 18, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees who have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him. And Romans 11, we saw, verse 4, is a quote of this. God says, future, will leave 7,000 in Israel. There's a percentage, very small percentage likely, of Israel. And those people fear me, like Obadiah does, like other prophets, like Elisha is probably one of them, who have not bowed the knee to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him, they would not worship Baal. They're true to me. God has a remnant, and Paul's using that analogy in the New Testament in Romans 11, and I won't repreach Romans 11. So then we have in verses 19 to 21, just the final, how he gets Elisha. Elisha's likely a wealthy man because he's in a wealthy family as a young man. He's got 12 yoke of oxen. It's kind of a yoke of oxen similar in our day to having a car. And if anyone has 12 cars today, you're like, oh, you got a big garage. You have a lot of wealth because cars go down in value. But to have 12 yoke of oxen was to be a pretty wealthy person. And Elisha's in a wealthy family. Elijah's probably not. And Elisha's going to live in unwealthy places in the future. But he throws his cloak over him and says, I want you to follow me. He says, let me go back. And it's not like I don't want to follow you. He's like, okay, let me finish what I'm doing here, Elijah, and then I'll follow you. And that's exactly what he does. And he comes at the end of verse 21. He arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. All right, so what should we learn? There's a reality whenever we feel alone. I don't know in New England if you ever feel alone, but it's very likely that you are surrounded many times by unbelievers. You feel like you're the only Yahweh follower in the midst of Baal worship. Like we're the only ones who aren't flying rainbow flags and not bowing the knee to the sexual revolution. That can feel, you can feel like that at times. And you can feel like we're the only ones who are still pro-life, and everybody around us, everybody we have to vote for is pro-choice or pro-abortion. You're like, disgusting. This is awful. But when it comes to our darkest times, God's servants go toward him. Elijah was going toward Mount Sinai because that's where he said, I got to get refreshed. I got to get a fresh view of God here. The covenant was broken. I'm in the middle of covenant breaking people. I need to get away. And he refreshed himself. He felt obviously despairing of life. He wasn't suicidal. He wanted God to take his life. And God never says, I'm not taking your life, Elijah. I got more for you to do. Go get busy. So God's servants go toward him in the darkest times of ministry. Don't isolate yourself. We have a church. God wants us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. We need each other. I can't tell you how many times you guys and many others in our church have refreshed me. God shows us a fresh vision of himself in the word. We realize that he is the Almighty. We also realize something important, that when Elijah has to do these three things, and God says to him, you have three things to do. And the last one is you get your successor. You're like, what? I'm getting the guy who's going to replace me. Yep, I want you to do. Keeps Elijah humble, but also Elijah realizes the work that God has on earth is bigger than Elijah. Yeah. And the work that God has for us is bigger than us. There will come a day that I'm not a pastor anymore. Mm-hmm. So it is. That's fine. And many of you realize the work that God wants you to do might be getting someone to take your place in your family as the godly leader, in your workplace, in your place of ministry, to train somebody else. And Elijah trains Elisha for 11 years. Mm-hmm. We realize that God is the Almighty and he doesn't need us to minister to anyone, but often in despair, he gives us people to minister to and says, okay, not done with you. And I can tell you how many times that I've been despairing and then someone texts me and says, hey, Pastor, I got a question. I don't want a question. I want to feel bad for myself. I don't want ministry. I want to mope. And that's not what God's plan is. Okay. God gives us a fresh view of ourselves, of himself, and then says, get back to work. There's still more people. Mm-hmm. And often the way God gets us out of despair is to give us someone to minister to so we can point others to him.